Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. On today's show, I am so honored to have Gary Bauer from American Values join us. Gary is a remarkable human, patriot, and servant of this country, and a good friend, too, someone I've had the pleasure of knowing for many decades of my life. He served in President Ronald Reagan's administration for all 8 years as Undersecretary of Education and Chief Domestic Policy Advisor. Then after leaving the Reagan White House, Gary became president of Family Research Council and a senior vice president at Focus on the Family. Gary, you actually ran for president in 2000, which is really incredible. You served as a Trump appointee to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And today you serve as president of American Values, an educational nonprofit public policy organization, and chairman of Campaign for Working Families PAC, which is dedicated to electing conservative candidates to Congress. In addition to all that, you also serve as senior vice president of public policy for the Dr. James Dobson Family Institute. On top of that, you are co-hosting the Bauer and Rose podcast, which is featured on Just the News and SiriusXM Patriot Channel. You are a busy man. Welcome, Gary Bauer, to the show.
It's great to be with you, Kyle, but I have to be honest, I'm a little tired after hearing this descriptions of what I'm doing.
Should we wrap it? Thanks, Gary. Thanks for being here.
Maybe so. It's really been a great conversation.
But, we learned a lot.
Right.
You are our expert on all things Israel, and I'm so grateful for you because you not only understand all of what's going on with the historical context, but you really, on a daily basis, have your thumb on the pulse of what's happening internationally with regard to Israel, this conflict with Hamas, the United States relationship with Israel, which I'm not sure a lot of people quite understand just how reliant the United States is militarily and other ways in gathering intel, and our relationship with the nation of Israel has been and hopefully will continue to be so critical. And so today I'm really glad that you're with us because I'd like to kind of just take a few steps back for our listeners and understand that what's happening today, this is not necessarily new for the nation of Israel, that they have a terrorist group or any group kind of coming at them, trying to take territory or potentially, eradicate Jews or attack the Jewish people. Israel has really had to fend off other nations and other groups really for all time, essentially, or since their existence. So maybe you can start off by just kind of taking us back a little bit and sharing with our listeners a little bit about that history of the nation of Israel.
Absolutely, Kyle. And you're right. It's a long history, and it's a very difficult history that Jews and Israelis have had to go through to be where they are today. Now, we could go all the way back to, for those of us familiar with the Bible, we could go all the way back to the Bible where Jews began. The Bible says there was a meeting in the desert between Abram and God. And in that meeting, God said to Abram, I will be your God and you will be my people. And those who bless you, I will bless. And those who curse you, I will curse.
Right.
So the Jewish people believe that is how their people group began in that meeting between God and Abram, later to become Abraham. And there's a long history that follows that of God leading the Jewish people into the land of Israel. We hear a lot of talk today, unfortunately, that the Jews are somehow interlopers, that they're settlers,
Sure, right.
They're going into somebody else's land. But in fact, Jews have been in the land, the Holy Land, for literally thousands of years.
That's right.
Jerusalem has never been the capital of any nation other than a Jewish nation.
Right.
And when Jerusalem was the capital of ancient Israel, Washington, D.C. and London, to just give two examples, were both swamps. I mean, there
Mm,
wasn't anything in either of those powerful capitals today. So, and then, of course, we could talk about this for hours.
right.
The Jewish people were conquered over centuries by a number of conquering powers, the Ottoman Empire, Persia, many others. The Jewish people were dispersed around the world,
Hmm.
although all through those centuries, some Jews continued to live there, and all that culminates in 1947, 48, when after World War II and the terrible Holocaust, in which 6, 7 million
Hmm.
Jews were murdered by the Nazis in Europe, the United Nations voted to restore the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland. And the United States became the first nation after that vote. Harry Truman was president, and he recognized the new Israeli nation that we see today.
Right. And that was also, Gary, a pivotal moment in biblical prophecy
Mm.
history for the nation of Israel. Isn't that right?
Yes, absolutely. I find a lot of young Christians either haven't been taught this, or they haven't zeroed in on God's word about all of this. But when you read the scripture, God's inspired word, you're not only reading a book that 95% of it was written by Jews,
Right, right.
but you're also reading a book that tells us that as God exposes history, as He unrolls history for us to see,
Mm,
that one of the things that would happen is that the Jewish people would be restored to their ancestral homeland. So when that happened at the end of World War II, many Christians around the world and here in the United States believed, I think correctly, that they were seeing the fulfillment of the scriptures about what the future would hold.
right. And after that time, after that restoration from 1948 on, the the Jewish people and the nation of Israel just continued to fend off attack, war after conflict after attack, all the way up into what we would call modern times in the first part of this century. With the Second Lebanon War in 2006, and now here we see a conflict again. So again, this isn't new for them. They have had to just continuously defend that land. Why is that? Why is that nation seemingly almost more than any other just continuously attacked?
But it's a great question. I mean, I've met many Israelis and many Jews who wonder why anti-Semitism is such a ongoing hatred that shows up in every generation. Let's go back a second to when the modern nation of Israel was reconstituted. At that very moment, now keep in mind the Jews were coming back to their land, their holy land, where they had been away from. They'd been in Europe and other places around the world. 6 million of them had been killed by the Nazis, by
Mm-hmm.
Hitler, and they come back, and literally the boats are arriving and letting European Jews out, and they're immediately being given weapons because right at the start of the new modern nation of Israel, five Arab Muslim nations declared war on them and attacked them. So there was an effort to kill the new Israeli nation in the crib, if you would. And so you can see the trauma in all of that. Now, why this keeps happening, that in some ways it's a theological argument. There's a lot of theology that says the Jewish people will be persecuted. because they were the people that, for Christians, our Savior came into the world through. And that leads to this battle between good and evil. But I think if you just look at it in geopolitical terms, I believe Israel's neighbors have a very hard time coming to grips with Israel because Israel is a free nation. It
Right.
believes in the same values that the United States believes in: the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of worship. And almost all of their neighbors, well, I would say all of their neighbors ignore those things. If you haven't been to Israel, you need to go. I'm not talking about you, Kyle,
Right.
but
Everyone
our
does.
listeners, yeah,
Yes.
our listeners, because there are churches in Israel, there are mosques in Israel, and of course there are synagogues in Israel. Most of the rest of the Middle East, heavily Muslim, obviously, there are no synagogues, and in fact, in many of those nations, there are no Jews, none at all.
Wow.
And it's very rare to see a church in many of those nations, like Saudi Arabia. There aren't any. There are Coptic Christians in Egypt, and Christian communities in places like Syria, but very small and very persecuted. So I think in some ways, the region and the Islamic nations there despise Israel because of the values they hold up, and the fear that those values might someday lead the populations of those other countries to want that kind of freedom for themselves too.
Right. Right. So would you say that, you know, the goal for these other neighboring nations to Israel is to see the eradication of that nation or the complete takeover and take control of Israel? I think sometimes it's difficult for us as Americans, right, to understand what people believe in Middle Eastern nations, how they operate, how they think of each other, and what needs to happen in relation to one another. It's difficult for us to imagine that there could be a neighboring nation that wants to see every person in the country next door to them wiped out. That's hard for us. We're a compassionate country. You know, we kind of live and let live. We want to see people thrive and do well. We have disagreements, or sometimes things get more extreme than that. But we certainly don't, you know, look to the West and say, you know what, I really don't agree with what all those people are practicing and doing. Let's kill them all. And do you think that that is a fair assessment of what some of these neighboring nations think and feel about the nation of Israel?
There's no question about it. Now, Kyle, first of all, during the Trump administration, uh, President Trump was very pro-Israel,
Right.
and a lot of our allies in the Middle East, Arab Muslim allies like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, began to come to grips with the idea that Israel wasn't going anyplace. It was a stable, powerful country. Its economy was growing, and President Trump was able to negotiate some treaties called the Abraham Accords, where Egypt and several of the other nations recognized Israel and began to open up better diplomatic and economic relationships.
Right.
But
And what's happening with that now? Are the Abraham Accords still in place under the
the,
Biden administration?
yes, it's interesting because when President Biden took office, he immediately ordered the entire administration to never use the words Abrahamic Accords, because that would be giving credit to the previous president, which I
Wow.
think is kind of silly, but there you go, right?
Well, silly's a kind word for it. That it has, you know, such broad implications in the protection of a whole nation. So that's really, I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yes, yeah. So I think in Egypt, there's still a desire to have good relationships with Israel. But the other reality is that we have a powerful country in the Middle East, Iran. They are in power. The mullahs of Iran, the radical Islamic government of Iran, took power in the revolution that took place during the American presidency of Jimmy Carter,
Mm,
and they are dedicated. Their whole reason as a nation is to have a second Holocaust. They
wow.
believe it is their duty given to them by Allah to kill all the Jews in the world, beginning with the 8 or 9 million Jews that live in Israel today. And they provide funds to radical Islamic groups
Mm,
uh, called Hezbollah, that is
yes.
based out of Lebanon, and then Hamas, which is in the news now, of course, every day,
Right.
uh, get their money and their weapons from the radical government in Israel and or I'm sorry, the radical government in
In
Iran, and
Iran, right. So
Hamas and Hezbollah
I
are
want to make
dedicated.
sure everyone understands how this unfolded because it can be a little bit difficult to track with all of the kind of different groups and sects that come out of the Middle East and who are their allies and who are their enemies. But
Yes.
if I've got this right, in 2006, with the Second Lebanon War, the Palestinian people elected Hamas as their form of government. So Palestine is not a nation. It is not a country. It is a group of people. Hamas is actually would you describe it as the people running the government or in control of the Palestinian people? Do I have that right?
You do, Kyle, and it's really hard to straighten out all of this. Something you just said there, I think, will shock people. There is no nation called Palestine.
Right.
There's never been a nation called Palestine. That was the name applied to a province in that area
Mm,
under the rule of the Romans. There were in the what is properly called Gaza today. That is a heavily Muslim nation, Arab Muslim nation. There were Israeli Jews that lived in Gaza for a number of years. They left over a decade ago in order to give the people of Gaza a chance to govern themselves, make
mm.
their own decisions for better or worse. Elections were held, and Hamas was put into power.
Right. And how
And
did that go for the people living in Gaza?
well, it's it hasn't gone well. By any measurement, Gaza ought to be a very wealthy nation. It's
Huh.
got a border on the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, again, President Trump, when he visited the area, said, "My goodness, there ought to be 5-star hotels
Right.
all
It's
along that."
beautiful, right? People don't realize. I think that in our
Yes,
minds, we envision it as this war torn ghetto that's been decimated and has barbed wire and, just absolutely an area that's, racked
yes,
with devastation. But in reality, it's really quite beautiful. I mean, Israel is so beautiful.
it
But
is.
we have such a different picture of it in our minds because of this news coming out and being really filtered. So I'm glad to kind of dig in, and I appreciate you letting me ask you these questions because
Sure.
I'm not sure that we all kind of grasp what really is happening. So the people of Gaza elect Hamas. It's Would you categorize Hamas as a terrorist organization?
No question. In fact, the United States government has designated them as a terrorist organization, and in their charter, they actually say that their purpose for existing
Right.
is to work toward the day when literally every Jew and every Israeli will be murdered. And they've got this
Mm,
really disgusting part of the charter where they say that when the Islamic Messiah returns to kill all the Jews,
mm.
that the rocks and the trees will shout out, "There's a Jew hiding behind
Oh,
me.
wow.
Come and kill him." So this is
That's
something I
horrific.
think is, yeah, beyond the understanding of most Americans, that kind of hatred.
I think so too. I think it's important that we try our best to grasp what they believe from birth, what they believe as a culture, as a community. And here's another tangle I want you to untangle for us, Gary, is, you know, so the people, the Palestinian people who are residing in Gaza with Hamas as their government, then they're right next to Israel.
Yes.
And just, are they just spending all day trying to attack Israel? What are they doing? And is that, you know, what has Israel's response been to that? And, you know, I have heard, I'm not extraordinarily clear on what this ongoing conflict has been since 2006, but it sounds like they have just been continuously attacking Israel, and Israel has just been continuously defending itself all the way up to what we saw on October 7th.
Yes. Kyle, you say you don't know a lot about the area, but you know a great deal.
Trying to piece it together. It's
yes,
complicated.
Well, you're doing a great job. So Iran poured money into Gaza and provided Hamas with missiles. And over the last several decades, every 6 months, every year or so, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other radical groups in Gaza would fire rockets and missiles into Israel, not aiming at military targets. In fact, in many cases, the rockets are too unsophisticated to be aimed. So they've hit schools over the years, they've hit synagogues, etc. And Israel has always responded to that. On occasion, Israel has gone into Gaza to try to locate where those missiles and rockets are being fired from, and deal with that. So that's been an ongoing sort of back and forth for a couple of decades.
Right.
In recent years, the Israelis have tried to reach out more and more to Gaza, and they began to allow citizens of Gaza to come and work in Israel. Israel's got a better economy, and there's not a lot of economic opportunities in Gaza. So every day leading up to this recent attack that came out of Gaza, I think it was something like 25,000 Gazans every morning would enter Israel, would have to go through checkpoints, obviously, to show IDs and make sure they weren't carrying weapons. And then they would go to work in various places, and then at night return back to Gaza. We found out after this horrible attack that took place on October 7th, from Gaza into Israel, an unspeakable atrocity that we can talk about more. But Israel has now figured out that a portion of those people that were coming from Gaza into Israel were going to work, but they were also spying.
Wow.
On when military units went to different places, where there were this number of soldiers and where there were places there would be no soldiers. And all of that was used on October 7th in order to more effectively kill Israelis when this attack was launched.
That's so disheartening to hear. It's almost the personification of no good deed goes unpunished. You know, here you have Israel extending a hand saying, hey, you know, it's better over here, come this way. And they use it for evil. What happened on October 7th, was that just a really, really, really much worse attack than the string of attacks that had been happening leading up to that day? Could you categorize it that way, Gary, as, you know, they had been attacking Israel and now they just took advantage of that goodwill being extended and did something so bad that they had to have known that an attack like what happened on October 7th and it was at such a level that they must have known that the nation of Israel would have retaliated in a more powerful way, perhaps, than they had to the other attacks. What do you think about that?
As I mentioned, a lot of the attacks on Israel in recent years had been these rockets and
Mm-hmm.
missiles, but also in the last 20 years, there's been a series of terrorist attacks by various Islamic groups whose bases are in Gaza and other surrounding areas. And there have been some incredible atrocities. The murder of Israeli children,
Mm.
bombing buses carrying kids to school, that sort of thing. So we've seen uh, some really unspeakable horrors. But what happened on October 7th was in a whole different category. The Israeli government came out, and they did their research and they looked. There's voluminous amounts of videos that were done. Some of those videos captured by security cameras, but some of the videos filmed by the attackers.
Right.
They were so proud of what they were doing,
Mm.
and all of that was recovered in the days that followed. And we know without a shadow of a doubt that uh, Israeli little girls as young as 7 or 8, all the way up to Israeli women in their 80s,
Mm-hmm.
were brutally raped. Uh, Multiple Israeli women were found with their pelvises broken because of the degree of violence during these sexual assaults.
Right.
And Kyle, I have to tell you, I was horrified to see feminist groups here in the United States and in Europe with this information coming out about using rape as a weapon of war.
Yeah.
And these are groups that have this slogan: if you something happens and you see it, report that as
Right. See
sexual
something, say
harassment.
something, believe
Right,
all
right.
women.
Yeah,
Some
but
of the
they,
some of these things that are, I mean, just even saying pales in comparison
yes,
to what
absolutely.
happened. And I do want to ask you about this, Gary, because I think right now this is what Americans are trying to grapple with. We're trying to understand this. We don't have much of a stomach for this type of war in our country. We haven't really seen it in our lifetime. Americans who fought in our wars are, there are older generations now, and our younger generations, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, our children, they are so far removed from anything like this in our day to day. Our perspective is just completely different. We're really lucky in that way. But it can be difficult to hear people's reactions to what happened on October 7th. What you just mentioned, the rapes that were so powerfully violent, it broke bones. Children
Yes.
being raped, women being hauled off and never seen again, videos taken of murders, videos and photos taken of bloodied dead bodies on the ground. I say it out loud because it's almost like we're having this like time machine moment here where we've disconnected from an appropriate reaction to the violence, to the brutality. It's almost like it's not real life. And what happened after that, I think we were properly horrified for a moment. This was the temperature that we kind of took here in hearing people's reactions in sort of these generations was, it's horrifying. But oh no, don't start a war. Don't go to war over this. There's a lack of understanding over like these centuries long conflicts. And October 7th kind of happened, I think, in people's minds and understandings like a brand new event. So, okay, this horrible terrorist attack happens. Yes, a response is warranted. We don't have the stomach for this. We can't listen to what happened. We can't read the reports. They're too traumatizing and horrifying just to read about, let alone, know anyone who is over there or hear about these real life experiences. But here's what's interesting, Gary, and I really am thankful for your take on this. The American people since October 7th have been polled on Israel's response. And it's been very, I would say, shocking to watch the needle move from, yes, a response is warranted. You have to fight back. That was the right thing to do, to, okay, here we go. We're in we've got another international conflict. There's another war happening. To, in the beginning of this year, American people so losing their ability to handle this, deal with it, hear about it, combined with this sort of like all of the sudden on the scene flood of anti-Semitism, and we're going to get to that, that now people are saying, a majority of Americans are saying that Israel has gone too far in its response. And we're really seeing the sort of ripple effect of that with the Free Palestine movement. And now, a whole movement of people protesting for the, I guess, decolonization of Gaza. I'm not even sure how to describe it. The protection of Gazan people, and we've completely shifted our focus, and I think very quickly shifted our focus from that's horrifying what happened on October 7th to wait a minute, we have to stand up for and protect the Palestinian people and anyone living in Gaza. Your reaction to all of that?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great analysis, Kyle. There's a lot of things to say on this. Historically, free men and women, uh, after they've enjoyed relative peace for a period of time, uh, begin to lose sight of reality, and free men and women regularly deceive themselves, often until it's almost too late. I and we've got sadly a younger generations that I think they've been robbed of history. They haven't been taught our history correctly. They don't know the sacrifices that have been made that allow them to live the lives they live.
Right.
You've got social media that is being dominated by groups and entities that are very anti-Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's hard for Americans to get their arms around the idea that there could be such hatred that people would do what we saw on October 7th and will continue to do that every chance they get unless they are eliminated. That's just a fact. I guess the most notable example is World War II, right? And even with the lack of history that people have, everybody knows who Adolf Hitler was.
Right.
Well, I got news for you. You couldn't hug it out of Adolf Hitler, right? There was no amount
Wait,
of
Gary, he was bad, right?
yes, there was no amount of kindness or love that would have made Adolf Hitler different than who he was.
Mm.
And I just think that that's something we just can't put our arms around.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me mention this because it's hotly debated right now. People are saying, well, why doesn't Israel just let the other side have their own nation?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what President Biden's saying. That's what the UN's saying. Even former President Bush was pushing that idea for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Two nations living side by side in peace and harmony.
Sure,
Well,
that sounds great. And a giant rainbow can go across it also, and instead of needing the Iron Dome. I mean, it sounds really good on the surface. And again, I think that as Americans, this is our way, right? We are peacemakers and peacekeepers. And so that makes great sense that we would want to see that happen. Will it work? And if not, why won't it work?
yes. Well, you have to have somebody in the neighborhood, the neighborhood being the Middle East, that actually thinks that's a viable solution. And here's the amazing thing. So a lot of the American media is focused on the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel is saying publicly, look, in the aftermath of this attack, nobody in Israel is talking about giving up land for a new Palestinian state. What the American media is not reporting is that there have been multiple polls in Gaza about a two-state solution, and the polls overwhelmingly reject a two-state solution. The
Mm,
polls in Gaza show they want one state in which Israeli Jews would be a minority,
wow.
and it would be yet another of a Muslim Arab majority state, of which there are already dozens.
So they don't
So,
actually want
no,
their own little corner to try and live peacefully separate from Israel. They
that,
want the whole pie.
that's exactly right. So, um, I, I'll ask you a trick question. How many Jews were living in Gaza on the day before the attack in Israel? The answer is zero. When Israelis left Gaza, all of them left. And not only did every living Israeli that had been living in Gaza leave and return to Israel, they literally had to dig up the graves of dead Jews that had been buried in Gaza and bring those deceased Jews
Mm.
back to Israel because they knew the graves of dead Jews in Gaza would have been
Oh,
desecrated
wow.
once all the Israelis had left and could no longer guard those graves. So this is a level of hatred.
Yes.
This is not like an Ohio State Michigan
No.
football rivalry. This is uh, a a philosophy rooted in radical Islam. It's not all Muslims, obviously. There are millions of Muslims around the world that want to live in peace with their neighbors, but there is a strain in Islam that believes they have a duty from Allah to
Mm.
kill the infidel, and the infidel are Jews and Christians.
And when you have that situation, what is the solution that achieves peace? Because it doesn't sound like the eradication of Israel. It doesn't sound like a two-state solution. It doesn't sound like the Palestinian people are going to be satisfied or stop attacking until they have it all. What is the solution that achieves peace?
So here's a short-term idea that probably long-term won't solve everything, but it is remarkable to me that more people aren't bringing it up. So Israel has been winning this war with Hamas,
Mm-hmm.
and Hamas is down to four, I think they're referring to them as battalions in a city called Rafah in
Mm-hmm.
Gaza.
Yes, we've been hearing a
So
lot
if
about
those four
Rafa lately, and I am not up to speed, so I'm going to need you to break that down for me.
Yeah, so Hamas retreated to that city, and many Palestinian refugees have gathered in that city. And Israel feels like it cannot allow those four battalions of Hamas soldiers to escape because they'll just build themselves back up and we'll be back on this
Right,
treadmill again.
right.
So if those four battalions surrendered today,
Mm-hmm.
and release the 200 hostages that they still hold, the war ends. The killing in Gaza
Mm-hmm.
ends. The humanitarian crisis ends. Why is all the pressure on Israel
Right.
to stop the war when the easy way to stop the war is for the loser to stop fighting and sue for peace? I'll guarantee you this, Kyle, that uh, if Hamas was winning the war, these people that are calling for a ceasefire would not be calling for a ceasefire. They're calling for a ceasefire because Israel is winning.
Is it just easier for them to back the little guy or feel like they're standing
I
up for the person who's losing?
there may be some people motivated by that, but I think a lot of it is the people and the groups that are calling for a ceasefire actually were hoping that Israel would lose the war. They
Wow.
wanted Israel to lose. They don't want there to be an Israel.
Mm.
But now that Israel clearly is not going to lose, well, then you run to the United Nations and try to build up international pressure to win through international action what you can't win on the battlefield.
Right. So the UN Security Council has just made the decision to call for a ceasefire, and there has been criticism of the United States for abstaining from that vote firstly, and then not vetoing the decision. How is that going to have an impact on what happens, or will it actually have an impact other than just communicating to the world where the UN stands currently and what the United States' position on this conflict is?
Yes, the Israeli people have grown very used to quote unquote the world being against them.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, that's been going on for decades, and but all during those decades, the Israeli people took great comfort in knowing that the United States of America was with them. And I've talked to a lot of Israelis in the last week, and they are stunned by what the Biden administration did at the United Nations. They feel like they've been abandoned, and whether the White House realizes it or not, that what's happened, it makes it less likely that Israel can make any concessions because they are coming to the conclusion that they're by themselves.
Right, they're on their
They've
own
got to
now.
take care of themselves. Nobody else
Yes.
is going to do it for them.
And Gary, what does that mean then if the United States relationship with Israel becomes, let's call it severed? What does that mean? What has our relationship with Israel been that has been a benefit to both nations? And why is that such an important relationship to maintain?
Well, Israel has an incredible intelligence service. They have to. Quite frankly, it appears to have failed on October
Right?
7th.
That's right.
Current Israeli government will probably eventually pay a price for that when their elections come up. But Israel's very worried that Iran is getting a nuclear weapon, and Iran could drop two nuclear weapons on Israel, and Israel and 8 million Israeli Jews would be gone. So they've got to have a great intelligence service to prevent that from happening. So we often rely on their intelligence to warn us about dangers or attacks, terrorist attacks that might be coming our way. Israel has also given us permission to stockpile weapons that are our weapons in their country, because the Middle East is very important to the national security and the economy of the United States. As everybody knows, oil comes out of that region, other important supplies. And if all of that or any of that is cut off, the United States would be in real trouble. So we have to be ready to respond when there's an emergency. And that can take months to get equipment to the region in order to be able to use it. So Israel allows us to pre-stockpile that so that all we would have to do is get our military in the region and the equipment would already be there. So this would be a real blow if the U.S.-Israel alliance was broken. And then there's a theological part of this that I worry about.
Right.
Because I do believe that the Jewish people are a covenant people, as we talked about a little bit earlier. And I think if the United States abandons Israel, I fear that God will take his hand of protection away from the United States.
Right. And yeah, we're talking about a couple of different things here. It seems like the United States has a lot at stake in Israel. Should Iran take nuclear action, which would be just an absolute nightmare, not only for the loss of life, but we have all our stuff there too. We've got people, we've got weapons. We have, I mean, what an absolute just complete nightmare that would set off should that happen. And then you're absolutely right. I mean, for those many Americans who believe in God, believe in the Bible as the Word of God, Israel is the place in which we watch to see, the prophecy of the second coming fulfilled. And there is a lot going on over there right now. And so for the United States to be accused of, I mean, I'll say accused of here, and not in absolute terms, of turning our back on Israel, the implications really expand far and wide.
Yes, yes, they do.
Help me break down this Free Palestine movement and what happened pretty quickly right after October 7th. I mean, in my lifetime, I'm not sure about you, Gary, but I've never, I will say unequivocally, never seen anti-Semitic behavior so prominent and people so outspoken against the Jewish people in Israel, but particularly also Jews living here in the United States or Jewish American people. What do you think happened? Was it simmering below the surface? Is it coming through our educational institutions? Where did all of this anti-Semitism explode from all of the sudden?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was simmering there, and what happened on October 7th in the aftermath was like pulling a scab off of a wound. Suddenly, we couldn't ignore anymore what was right there that we had averted our gaze from. I've done some work over the years with Christians United for Israel, and over a decade ago, we started getting calls from Jewish students on university campuses asking if we could get Christian students on the campuses to set up chapters of Christians United for Israel, because these Jewish students were seeing the anti-Israel sentiment growing and the anti-Semitism growing. And now we found out that this was happening on almost all the major American universities to a degree that I think was shocking to almost everyone. There were hearings held on this in Congress, and I'm sure you remember, Kyle, that a couple of university presidents lost their jobs because their testimony before Congress was so pitiful, and in their unwillingness or being unable to say that raw anti-Semitism and calling for a second Holocaust was a violation of their codes of conduct on the university campuses. And these were, this wasn't Podunk U. This was universities like Harvard and Yale and Columbia. We've actually seen, I've heard from Jewish families, whose sons or daughters are on these campuses, and they're saying, Mr. Bauer, our daughter is afraid to go to class. Our son wants to drop out of Stanford or Columbia because of the threats he's getting, and somebody is spray painting a swastika on his door.
Right. It was really shocking. It wasn't just, I think, a fear of having to stand up for their faith or having to stand up for their heritage. I think they were literally being physically assaulted at several campuses. It was not physically safe for them to be there during a time when this was all happening last fall. And, Gary, it's just so surprising, like where it's generating from, or has it just always been there?
There's been a number of things in our society, Kyle, and one of them is the research is overwhelming that we're becoming less and less religious in America, and more specifically, broadly speaking, what one would call Judeo-Christian ideas, that has been eroding. And we've seen in other places in the world, like Europe, for example, that as they became more secular and less Christian, they became more anti-Semitic.
Wow.
So there are large portions of Paris and London today that a French Jew or an English Jew cannot walk down the street with any obvious clothing or
Mm.
symbols that would label them a Jew without a very high risk of being assaulted. In Europe, the cradle of Western civilization, and I know Jewish friends in New York that have been accosted on the streets of New York City,
Goodness.
which is a city that has more Jews in it in America than any other city in the United States.
Well, it's so disturbing, there's nothing new under the sun, I guess. And what's sad about this is that we've gone through this in our history. We've gone through the worst possible time of Jewish persecution during World War II. And it's devastating, I would say, to see it resurge, and also this sort of reframing of what happened during the Holocaust, or this reframing of who Hitler was and what he believed. It's really surprising. I think the antidote to that is, as you mentioned before, Gary, we've got to be sharing our accurate history, especially with our kids, with our younger generations. They've got to know what really happened. We can't wash it clean. We always have this desire to soften the blow, I think, of what has happened. We have a lot of discussions about, our country's history with slavery. It's difficult to talk about these things. They're horrifying things that happened in history, but we are literally setting ourselves up to be doomed to repeat it. We've been warned about doing this, and it seems like it's maybe starting to happen again. So I'm so grateful for the information, because this is what we have to talk about. We have to understand what's been going on so that we can have the appropriate reaction. We've got to be supporting the right side here. This is a true good versus evil conflict with really devastating consequences. And, I, in my show, have a moment where I like to take a Pollyanna moment, because I feel like I'm the eternal optimist here. We're all going to be okay. Everything's going to be all right. Everybody go find Jesus, because that's what we need here.
I hope I'm not
we just
turning
need
you
Jesus
into a
is going to be
cynic.
okay, Gary. But I will say that maybe looking for the silver lining in all of this, and having my Pollyanna moment of this discussion, is that, yes, it's horrible what we're seeing. It's any time of conflict and war, of death, of violence, is one of the worst things that can happen. But we're also seeing a lot of things occur, a lot of markers that feel like we are kind of pushing ahead toward our ultimate goal. If you believe in God, if you believe in the Bible, and you see these sort of milestones met of what the point is here, the point of us existing, of being on earth, and kind of seeing it start to move in that direction. There's hope in that, isn't there?
Oh, of course. I mean, I as the years go on in my own life, I don't know how people that don't have a faith perspective rooted in God's word, I don't know how someone deals with all the things that life deals out to us, right? I mean,
Right.
this is a vale of tears, as the Bible says. But we know, again, if you believe the Bible is God's word, we
Mhm.
know how it all ends, and it all ends with the triumph of the God of the Bible and His Son Jesus. Between now and then, though, it is left to us, free men and women, to conduct ourselves in a way that when we're standing before the throne, we'll hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." So
Mhm.
I'm so glad you're doing this show, Kyle, because it's another vehicle to encourage, particularly young Americans,
Mm,
that with all the troubles of the world, you have an incredible opportunity to join one of the great struggles confronting mankind and to stand for what's good and decent and right and moral. And by doing that, save liberty and freedom for another generation
yeah.
of free people, which is no small thing.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, Gary. That is so hopeful, and honored to be here taking a crack at this and talking to you about it. I want to leave our listeners kind of with your final thoughts, and I'm going to ask you several questions, so
Okay.
bear with me. But taking a step back and looking at what's happening with Israel right now today, what's true, what's real, what is really happening? How do we view this through the lens of truth and accuracy? And as just regular American citizens, not holding political office or not being in the military, or just your average everyday, men and women, trying to understand this. What's our role? What do we do, and how can we help and support the right efforts here?
Well, that's a deep question, Kyle. Look, I think one of the biggest challenges we have today is finding truth. We live in a blizzard of lies.
Mm,
There are all sorts of forces that want to tell us things that don't coincide with common sense, with
mm-hmm.
reality, with what our own instincts tell us. And so I would just urge everybody to don't assume because some well-coiffed individuals on your TV set or on your computer screen speaking with great authority that you're hearing what the truth is. Seek out other sources that you might have to look for a little bit. There are plenty of sources in Israel that you can avail yourself of. There are public groups out there like Christians United for Israel and
Mm-hmm.
the James Dobson Family Institute, which is very pro-Israel. My own group, American Values, which you can get up to date and truthful information about. So I would just encourage people to do that. Look, this has always been a reality check for me, at least since 9/11. On that horrible day when we were attacked, most of us were very angry, sad, but really angry. And I remember what it felt like turning on the news and seeing in some places in the Middle East people celebrating what had happened to us. They literally came out of their houses and shot guns in the air and handed candy out to their children.
Mm.
And then, as I was feeling despair by seeing that, I saw the scenes coming out of Jerusalem. And what I saw were the Israeli people weeping with us, Israel lowering their flag as we were lowering ours. And to me, it reminded me that in a world where allies can be fair weather friends that change depending on whatever's happening last, Israel has been a reliable ally of the United States since its reformation as the modern state of Israel. And I would hope that we would all work to make sure that that alliance remains strong and that we understand that we're joined at the heart with the Israeli people and we're joined with shared values
Mm-hmm.
more than many of the other nations around the world that we see in the headlines every day.
Wow. So well said, Gary. You are so brilliant, and I could just have these conversations with you all day. As you said, the resources are so important to be discerning about. You have a show, Bauer and Rose, and you also do this incredible end of day report. Talk about just getting down to the basics. You make it nice and easy for everybody. So I encourage everyone to to definitely find Gary Bauer's End of Day Report. I know it's on your website, ouramericanvalues.org. I think what you shared today is so incredibly important. And I'm glad our listeners were able to hear your insights, because what you have suggested, I mean, it's brilliant. Who do we call? Can you pick up the phone? because this isn't, we shouldn't be calling for free Palestine. We shouldn't be calling for, save Gaza. Of course, everyone can agree, I think, that we all want innocent life protected. Nobody wants to see anyone harmed, period. I mean, really, at the end of the day, we don't want anyone hurt or harmed. We don't want to see violence. We don't want to see war. We can all agree on that. But instead of this free Palestine, this call for ceasefire, which isn't going to work, and it's not what they want anyway and what they're asking for, it's Hamas surrender. That should be our battle cry as a nation and as a planet. Hamas surrender. I love that idea. I think that's brilliant. Gary, I'm just so grateful to you. Thank you for all you do for our country, for everyone around the world, in understanding how important in so many ways Israel and people of the Jewish faith are to us. So I'm so grateful to you, and hope to have you on the show again soon, because there's so much more to talk about always.
I would love to do that, Kyle. And I want to say that, having been in this battle for more years than I care to remember, when I see people like you and knowing your good work, you're articulate and knowledgeable, it gives me heart that I know there are people coming up that are going to continue to fight the good fight for faith, family, and freedom, and for the American Republic.
Well, thank you, Gary. I appreciate you so much. We love this country, and we're in it together, aren't we?
Absolutely.
All right, Gary Bauer, thank you so much. Thank you all for being with us today on this episode of Politically Basic. Just a reminder that we are truly all in this together as Americans. We share so much more in common than we realize. And we have been called to understand why that is. So I thank you for listening. I thank you for joining us. Continue to download episodes. Take a look at our website, politicallybasic.com, to make sure you catch those as they're dropping. Follow us on socials at Politically Basic, and we hope that you will join us next time. I'm Kyle Campbell, and this has been Politically Basic, where we break down the basics and let you decide.